Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today at Morphy's with a really cool, pretty rare World War I machine gun. This is a Marlin model of 1917, which is essentially a slightly modified, licensed copy of the Colt model 1895/1914, which is in turn a slightly improved version of the Colt model 1895, aka the Potato Digger, because this is a gas-operated gun, but it doesn't use a linear gas piston. It uses a swinging lever. This was John Browning's first machine gun, which is why some of the design elements are a little awkward. He submitted a prototype of this to Colt in 1890. This is really, really early. His main contemporary at this point was the Maxim gun. There was actually some patent dispute between Browning/Colt and Maxim over gas operating systems. But Colt introduces this in 1895, and they are dead sure that the US Army is going to adopt it. That's why they name it the Colt Model 1895, because they're sure it's also going to become the US Army model of 1895. Primarily in caliber 3040 US, 3040 Krag, because that's what the US Army was using at the time. Well, the US Army decided not to adopt it. The US Navy did adopt it, interestingly, in 6mm Lee Navy, which the Navy and the Marines had decided to use at that point. Well, at some point, I'll get my hands on an original 1895 in 6mm Lee Navy, and we'll talk about that whole story at that point. But in the meantime, Colt fails to get any significant US military contracts. He sells like 200 of them to the Navy, Colt does. Instead, they go out onto the civilian market, they go looking for buyers, and they sell some. They offer it in basically any caliber imaginable because it's easily adapted to any rifle caliber, basically. Belt-fed, whatever you can stuff in a belt, you can design the gun to feed off, no big deal. But it's really not that successful of a gun until World War I. And when World War I breaks out, a lot of people discover that they need a lot more machine guns. It's only World War I when a lot of countries truly begin to understand just how crucial and transformative the machine gun is in modern warfare. There were a few countries that had been paying attention to things like the Russo-Japanese War and recognized what was coming. No one fully got it, but once World War I starts, the learning curve gets real steep real fast. So Colt starts getting all sorts of orders. They end up making, like 18,000 of these produced during World War I, and Colt's also busy making all sorts of other stuff. So ultimately, they run out of manufacturing capacity, and they start looking for a subcontractor that they can license this gun to. And they come up with Marlin. The Marlin Firearms Company had looked like an opportunity for one J.P. Morgan, who goes ahead, buys it, restructures it, and starts looking for contracts. He gets a contract from Colt to manufacture a copy of Colt's gas-operated machine gun for all sorts of Western allies in World War I. The Canadians, by the way, actually adopted this gun. Everybody else just bought it sort of as a stand-in because they needed anything that could shoot automatically and sit on a tripod. So Marlin, one of Marlin's employees at the time was a guy named Carl Gustav Swabilius. He was a Swedish expatriate and a very talented gun designer who had a wide and important history in firearms design. He was employed by Marlin at this point, and he went ahead and redesigned this gun to get rid of the swinging gas piston and go to a straight linear piston instead. And Marlin would end up making like 38,000 of those guns during World War I for the US Air Service, because this swinging link is not a good thing. You can't mount that on an airplane, that gets in the way. But you want a closed bolt gun like this for synchronization to run with a propeller on a modern in 1917 fighter aircraft. So you take the Colt gun, which is already lighter and closed bolt. Well, the Maxims are closed bolt too, but it's a much lighter, handier gun than the Maxim. And you get rid of the gas piston, give it a longitudinal gas piston, and you're off to the races. And Marlin sold tens of thousands of those things. I actually have a video on one of those Marlin straight piston guns that I'll link to in the description text if you want to see more about it. But they did also make copies of the 1914 pattern Colt gun, which is this. The biggest client was Russia, who bought, I think Marlin made more than 7,000 of them for Russia. They also sold 2,500 or so to the US Army in 1917 specifically as training guns. They weren't taken to Europe, they weren't used in combat, they were used on the home front to train machine gunners. Again, because it was a gun that was available. You can teach guys everything that isn't gun specific about being a machine gunner. How do we work as a team? What is plunging fire? What is grazing fire? How, all of these conceptual things you can train with any machine gun, like one that's available from Marlin, like this guy. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit too much here. Let's go ahead and take a closer look because we're going to pull this apart. A lot of people think this is a giant block of steel. This is actually a couple of side plates all bolted together. Let's start with some markings here. We have the Marlin markings on top of the gun. This is obviously a way to tell that it's not a Colt-made gun. And they did put their markings on the receiver as well as the barrel, because the barrel is detachable on this gun. I'll get to that in a minute. Next up on the barrel, caliber 30 USA and serial number. So these are in 30-06. Then here on the receiver, US, the inspector's initials, the date of manufacture, which is 1917, and then the caliber, which is caliber 30, model 1906. That's 30-06, and the serial number, which does match the barrel. Now, from front to back, there are a couple things that we can point out that are distinctive of the later pattern Colt 1914s or Marlin 1917s. And first up is the sight. The new front sight is taller and it has a hood. The original Colt guns have an unprotected short front sight on the barrel. One of the most distinctive changes is the use of this finned barrel. The original Colts had a solid, huge diameter, solid barrel. The idea was it would be heavy enough that it could survive sustained fire. In practice, they found it still couldn't, even as heavy as that barrel was, it would overheat and then it would lead to cook-offs. So Colt redesigned it with a barrel that could be detached. The way you would do that is by opening up the gas lever. This is a little locking lever. There was a wrench tool that came with the gun. You would take the end of the wrench, pop that lever up. That unlocks this, which is connected to the receiver from the barrel. You would then put the wrench into this cutout and you can unscrew the barrel. Now, I don't have the wrench and this barrel is really tight, so we won't be taking it out, but they did make it with a replaceable barrel so that when it got hot, you could just change it. Next up, this door. So this is where empty cases eject, of course, the ejection port. This is where the empty belt comes out. On this side, the belt goes in here. So you have the full width of the cartridge here. The belt goes in, the cartridges strip off on a little sprocket, which we'll take a look at when we take the gun apart. And then the belt comes out. The problem is this is a very sealed up system and you've got a weird feeding system down in here. So what do you do if you have a malfunction? Well, the original Colt design had a little open port about half this width. Marlin, going back through the guns, decided A, we want more open area to get access to the gun, and B, we don't want dirt getting in there. So they put a little sliding door on it, and that allows us access to the feed system to clear any malfunctions. The rear sight is a bit simpler on the Marlin. The Colt guns have a rotating multi-aperture setup similar to the 1904 Maxims. And then the pistol grip changed. So the original Colts, the grip slides in and then the Colts have a pin that goes through to hold it in place. Marlin updated that to be this locking lever that's a little more secure, a little easier to work with too. So those are the differences between the Marlin guns and the earlier pattern guns. To take a look for a moment at the mechanics, this is our gas piston. Like that specifically right there is the piston. There's a gas port in the barrel right here. Gas gets tapped off that. It pushes this lever down. The lever pivots inside here. This is connected essentially to the operating slide of the gun. So it's this lever that makes stuff happen inside. And there's enough, this is given enough of a push that it will swing all the way back like this before the recoil springs. Push it back that way. This is where the gun got its moniker of the potato digger, because if you don't use your tripod and you put this thing down on the ground and start shooting it, it will try to dig a hole in the ground as this lever swings back and forth under the gun. Now, if we look at what's actually happening when I cycle the lever, you can see the bolt is tilted down at the back. That's the locked position. As the lever swings, it pushes the bolt up, which unlocks it. It then starts to cycle backwards. This right here is a little hook that catches in the extractor rim of a case. So it's going to grab a cartridge from the belt right there, pull it backwards all the way back here until this piece right here pops up right there. That acts kind of like the lifter in a shotgun, frankly. It's going to push the cartridge up in line with the chamber. You can see that lifter right there. That's the end travel of the piston and the bolt. So when the piston comes forward, the bolt starts to come forward. The bolt's going to push that cartridge directly into the chamber and then fire it, while this returns forward, drops down, snaps under the rim of the next cartridge. All right, so let's take this apart now. We're going to start with the pistol grip. This is a lever that is going to lock the pistol grip in place. I just need to pop this up like so. Then it opens to that side. That comes out on this side, and I can pull the pistol grip right out the back. And that thing is a weapon all by itself. That is the, what would you call this? This would be like a linear hammer. So I'm gonna drop the safety here and pull the trigger. Let's see. There we go. Gently let that up. When you pull the trigger and fire, it simply releases this. The trigger has a little hook on it that locks over that ridge. And when you pull the trigger, this smashes forward into the firing pin at the back of the bolt and fires the gun. And so if you have this thing loaded and cocked like that, you can, if you hold this, this is a safety, which prevents it from firing when you don't want to. But if you hold that down, you can like just go shoot this thing like a little pocket pistol. All right, so I'm gonna skip the next step because I'm gonna kind of bypass it. If you're just field stripping the gun and you just need to get the bolt out, what you do is open the gas piston all the way, and you then have access to the pin that holds the bolt in. So you put on the original Colt guns, you took the pin that held the pistol grip in and you used it here as a tool to push the bolt pin out the big hole on the other side. Marlin redesigned it. You don't have that built-in tool anymore. You would use a punch to do it. But I'm just going to take the side plate off instead. All right, I've got 3 screws here, here, and here that I have to take out. And each one of them is held in place by a little locking screw. So I'm going to open that up to that point. And we'll unscrew these guys. And with those 3 out, I can pop off. There we go. The entire side plate. This thing is cool, and it's, in many ways, it's not really like anything else quite out there. It was a very early machine gun design. Anyway, this is built from a left side plate, a right side plate on the bottom, this bottom plate, which is also now completely removable, and then like the action system. All right, go ahead and pull the other side plate off as well, and then there we go. And the bottom plate comes off. All right, a couple things to point out. These 2 tubes actually hold the recoil springs. So you can see this centerpiece compressing backwards right in there. It is compressing 2 springs. That's what gives motive force to the piston to return it home after firing. This is the feed sprocket inside the gun. So when you load it, the belt comes across here, and then the rounds sit on that sprocket, and they advance up to that position where the extractor is going to pull this round backwards out of the belt. And that's why, as soon as you get past top position, you don't have a cartridge, so you only need a little narrow space for the belt to come out. So belts for these guns and belts for the Browning 1917 and 1919 are almost indistinguishable. However, they are slightly different. Because of this sprocket system, the digger belts have to be, the cartridges have to be spaced a little bit farther apart. Technically, it is 17 rounds per foot in I keep wanting to say Browning, but Browning designed this thing too. 17 rounds per foot in a 1917 belt, and 16 rounds per foot in a digger belt. So generally speaking, usually digger belts can be identified by having 2 black stitched stripes on US ones. However, that's not universal. This has 2 stripes on it, and this one is actually a 1917 belt. These belts can be used if you stretch them out a little bit. They will mostly work, but not super reliably. Unfortunately, original correct Colt 1895/14/Marlin 1917 belts are extremely rare today. I think what ended up happening was that the US military deliberately got rid of them because they weren't quite the same as Browning belts. They will function in Browning 1917 guns just fine with that wider pitch, but they're really hard to find today. This is a difficult gun to show you the function of because everything's held together by the parts that I have now removed. So I am actually going to refer you to the VBB SMYT video that has a 3D rendering of this functioning. I'll link to it down in the description below. Now that you've seen this, you have a pretty good understanding of the physical nature of the gun, and seeing his 3D exploded view video, transparent video of how the gun cycles will really bring home exactly how all the parts work. So check that out for a full cycling demonstration. I will point out this guy. This sits right here in the side of the gun, and its job is actually to act sort of as the auto sear. So when you've got your fire mechanism, your trigger and striker here, I can hold the trigger and nothing happens because we have this secondary sear also holding this guy in place. What you don't want to happen is to have, if I hold the trigger down to shoot, you don't want this to just follow the bolt forward because it won't have enough energy to actually fire a primer. So instead, you want the bolt to go forward, close, lock, and then release this. And that's the job of this lever and this secondary sear. So this guy sits in the gun with that pin resting right there. When the bolt's all the way forward, this pivots like that, which drops this. If you're holding the trigger, the gun will fire. If you've released the trigger, then the trigger will hold this in place and it won't fire. I suppose I should add, there is no semi-auto feature on the any of the Colt 1895 family of machine guns. It's just full auto, and the rate of fire is a pretty sedate 450 rounds a minute. All right, now we're going to go ahead and take the bolt out. This is the little hole for the bolt pin. All right, that comes out, and then I can pull the bolt out the back of the action, and that's what it looks like. So that bolt pin normally sits right there. So as the bolt travels forward and back, that cams it up and down. And then this fin at the front is what picks a cartridge up out of this elevator and lifts it up into the chamber. Whew, all right, there is a Marlin model of 1917 potato digger. Halfway detail stripped. That's a bit more than field stripped, but I didn't pull every little component out of that for you. Machine guns were expensive in World War I. I think it's interesting to note that the contract between Colt and Marlin to manufacture these guns included, for the first 5,000 guns sold, Marlin would pay a $100 per gun royalty. Like, that's an immense amount of money. That's half a Thompson gun, essentially, in just the royalty payment to Colt. And about half of that money went to John Browning, who had invented the thing. John Browning became a truly wealthy man from all of his various inventions, to the point that there were a couple guns where he provided them to the US military and basically said, don't worry about paying me a royalty. I've got enough. This is for the war effort. Anyway, Marlin ended up paying, the contract included a maximum royalty payout of $1.5 million, after which Marlin would be free and clear to make as many more of them as they wanted. Marlin paid that full amount to Colt with all of the guns that they produced during World War I. However, most of them were the straight piston guns that went primarily on aircraft. These didn't do very well after World War I. By the time you're done with World War I, this thing is well and truly obsolete. It doesn't have the sustained fire capability of the water-cooled guns, and it doesn't have the portability of the air-cooled guns like the Lewis, like the new American Browning automatic rifle. The US has the model of 1917 Browning machine gun, which is just better than this in pretty much every way. So Colt actually kept this gun in their catalog after World War I, and between 1919 and 1934 they sold 29 of them, which is essentially zero. They probably had more than that just lying around in spare parts that they were able to assemble. So these are today pretty rare guns. Original 1895s are very rare guns. I look forward to being able to get my hands on one of those one of these days to show to you guys. But for the time being, hopefully you enjoyed checking out this one. A big thanks to Morphe's for letting me take a closer look at this and take it apart for you guys. These are really cool and hard to find. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.